Have you ever wondered why our bodies need both salt and bananas? Imagine steering a boat where the sodium pushes from one side and potassium pulls from the other, balancing perfectly to keep you sailing smoothly. But what happens when the balance is off? Well, today we are diving into the world of sodium and potassium, where maintaining that balance can mean the difference between a healthy life and a life full of chronic disease and health issues. So we are here. I'm going to say this topic is pretty sensitive to me because I love salt. It's one of my favorite things. Hearing that, we have to. And I've heard both sides. The two sides. So this is what I've heard before. And we're going to clear any misconceptions up today. But yes, if you have too much salt, let's say salt, which is really where the sodium comes from, that you're going to it leads to high blood pressure. But I've also heard the other side that our body needs salt, so it's okay to have salt. And that's both of those are actually true statements. But we're going to again dive into it so I can explain why they're both true statements. But they don't mean that you can have more table salt or Himalayan salt. And that's the sad part for me because I love salty foods. And my kids would say that I over salt. And I don't put salt on things, I put it in when I'm cooking. I'm happy to report over the last few months, I have actually been almost sodium free of putting things in my diet. But, the first thing is our processed foods typically have a lot of salt in them because, like me, for like a lot of other people, can you relate to liking salt? Yeah, so salt tastes good to us. And the other thing that salt does is similar to sugar. It helps warp our taste buds. So when you don't have salt, things don't taste as well. Similar to sugar, we're hypersensitive to sugar, so that we like the taste of really sweet things. And so the sweetness we get from nature and the salt we get from nature, we don't really see that because we're too busy with this amplified taste that we have. But the good news is that we can change our tastes. It only takes a few weeks. But yes, you have to suffer for a few weeks. All right. So we're going to talk about sodium and potassium and why we need them both. And so let us get started. I'm going to put up my slides and get ready here. All right. So we're going to start with the basics. So we're going to talk about salt because this is the first thing, is that salt is basically a compound formed by a reaction of a base acid with a base. So when you're talking about salts, we usually think of table salt or Himalayan salt as being salt. But if you go by the strict definition, salt is actually formed from a reaction of an acid and a base. So, for example, you have hydrochloric acid and sodium hydroxide. So that's an acid and a base. And they get together to form a reaction, and you end up with sodium chloride and water. And guess what? Sodium chloride is the salt that we are used to. But there's so many different kinds of salt. It doesn't have to be sodium chloride or what we know as table salt. Other forms um, salt could be potassium chloride or calcium chloride. So there's different ones, and that's coming from a purely chemistry. This is the pure definition from a chemistry perspective, and so what does that mean as well? So what are the roles of salts in the human body? And again, there's more than one. So potassium, which is where, I mean, I said bananas, but potassium is a very crucial salt as well, or electrolyte. And we need the potassium as well for our, and again, it's the balance between the sodium and potassium that's really crucial. So this is what balances the electrolytes and fluid regulation in our body. And it's also essential for nerve transmission and muscle formation and function. And also it's important in the absorption and transport of nutrients in our body. And our salt, this is the sad part for me, the requirement from an adult perspective of salt is actually less than 2,300 milligrams of sodium per day. Oh, and that's like a teaspoon of salt. So 2,300 milligrams sounds like a lot, but it's not. It's less than a teaspoon of table salt a day. So are you getting more than a teaspoon of salt a day? I don't know, but I sure was. I think, just one dish probably had at least a teaspoon of salt in it. And then you magnify that. So again, we talk about the importance of moderating our sodium intake to prevent risks like high blood pressure. And salts are vital for our health, but we have to make sure that we understand what the right amounts are. And most of us are actually potassium deficient. Most of us are potassium deficient and sodium overkill. We have overkill of sodium. So if we look at that, we're going to talk about the role. This is kind of the basic of what are the roles of sodium and potassium within our body. So the first thing is that they both play a very key role. As I said, there's a real balancing act between the two, and they play a role in maintaining our physiological balance and supporting our cellular function. And what happens is most of the sodium is found outside of our cell walls, outside of the cell, and most of the potassium resides within the cell. And so together they form this balance for regulating our blood volume, our blood pressure, and for ensuring our nerves and muscles function correctly. And so the sodium is part of the blood volume and the nerve and muscle function, and the potassium will make sure we have cellular fluid balance, heart function. It's good. It's important for heart function and for nerve signals. So between the two of them, these are really important, minerals. And this forms what's called the sodium-potassium pump, which actually actively exchanges the sodium and potassium across the cell membrane to maintain the cell function and overall health. So this is like the role. So they're really important. And when we don't have good balance between the two, that's when our cells become distressed and unhealthy. And that's where some of the way we can get our chronic diseases. So this sodium potassium pump what it does is it actually maintains the ion gradients across the cell membrane. So it basically maintains the electrical nerve impulses and the transmission. So this pump uses ATP, which we've heard this is ATP is how we get energy, to move sodium ions out of our body, out of the cell, and the potassium ions into the cell. And that's where, I don't know if you've ever heard of homeostasis, but that's the balance between the two in the cell. So that's really important if we want to have a healthy cells. Now, so then the question is, what happens if the balance, we get out of balance? So if we end up with high sodium, that's going to impact also the balance and how much potassium we have. So when sodium, it is necessary. We do need it. It is important. But because of our modern diet, we're actually, most of us are getting too much of it. And so what happens that this will disrupt the balance, and we end up with the chronic diseases. So if we have too much sodium, then that's going to decrease the potassium efficiency, and that's what will impact our blood pressure and our cardiovascular health. Now, on the other side, what are those health implications? So we end up with hypertension and cardiovascular risks, and also other diseases also can come from that. So one of the ways to, I guess, reverse the chronic disease is to regain that balance between the sodium and the potassium, and make sure there's enough potassium in the cells and the potassium or the sodium outside of the cells. Make sure that that pump is working properly. And when it's not working properly, we can end up with fluid. So that's where edema comes from, where there's a collection of fluid. It's a signal that the potassium sodium pump is not working properly. And on the other, so let's talk about the potassium. If there's not enough potassium, so what happens is, if there's not enough potassium, then that's also like the balance. So most people aren't getting enough potassium because the potassium is coming from our fruits and our vegetables, and not a lot of people aren't getting enough of the potassium. So that's going to aggravate if we're taking in too much sodium and not getting enough potassium. You can see that we're actually aggravating the balance because we're already with the sodium, too much sodium. And then if you have not enough potassium, now you've got a bigger, I guess, discrepancy between that balance. So what we're going to do then is that also acts into this whole, the health implications that we have. All right. And I just wanted to do a little, I guess, talk just about hyperkalemia, which actually, although most people are not getting enough potassium, there are some people who have too much potassium. And so that's also not good, to have too much potassium in your blood. And this can actually be dangerous to our heart rhythm. So because it does, potassium is part of the function of the heart. So if we have too much, it can disturb the heart rhythm. And although it's something that you should check out on your own, Some of the common causes are actually from kidneys not working properly, where they can't excrete the potassium properly. It could come from the medications that you might be taking, or there could be other reasons. But it's something that if you have this as an issue, you really should check with your doctor. You do need to be careful and not eat as much potassium and not take as much in. And I think that can be difficult because a lot of foods have potassium in them. But at the same time, I think it's important to find out why have so much potassium in your blood. So it's something to take very seriously and investigate with your healthcare provider. And so then I think that I wanted to just do a quick discussion about the different types of salts that we have. There's table salt, all right, and it is the most common salt that people will use, because I know you hear. I don't know if you've heard, pink Himalayan salt is better or Celtic sea salt is better. And so I thought, why don't we just take a look at them? And I think for table salt is actually very highly refined, and it's the most common salt. And it will typically be fortified with iodine, which is basically something we need for our thyroid health. And it also often will contain anti-caking agents that help it so that it flows freely, so it doesn't clump up. And then for Himalayan salt, pink Himalayan salt, it is quite popular now. It does have trace minerals in it, including potassium, magnesium, and calcium. But it also is, and it's minimally refined. Typically, I think more now you'll see some of it being more refined. And the pink color comes from the minerals in it. And so because it has the minerals, it's touted as having more benefits. Although there are some camps that will say that it's not, the amount of the minerals isn't enough to really make it that healthy, extra healthy for us. And then there's the Celtic sea salt, which is also minimally refined and coming from the sea. And it typically will have a grayish color, and that's because of the moisture content in it. And similar to the pink Himalayan salt, it does have minerals in it. They're a little bit different minerals than some of what the pink Himalayan has in it. But again, it's similar. The amount of the minerals is not a lot compared to the amount that really it's about the sodium. And so when it comes down to it, although I have been using pink Himalayan and some Celtic sea salt for quite a while now. I haven't had table salt in my house for a long time. Some of the experts would say that it doesn't matter. All three of them have sodium in them. And so it's not about which one to have, but which ones you should not have, which is all of them. And so then what do we do to manage our sodium intake? And so, I guess it's watching the salt shaker. To be honest, I would say that if you can actually basically remove the salt from your diet, and I know it would take a bit of getting used to, probably 2 or 3 weeks to actually redefine your taste. Choosing our fresh whole fruit, vegetables and fruits, and whole foods over processed items. Reading your labels, and if you're taking in whole foods, there's no labels. But if you're looking for stuff, just make sure that, if you are buying like canned tomatoes or canned chickpeas or something, get the sodium-free ones for sure. Look for those. And just watch for that. And then if potassium rich, you can have, if you unless you have hyperkalemia, potassium rich seasonings, which would be herbs and spices instead of salt. Lemon juice is really nice to add. It freshens things up and actually helps to pick up a little bit of that taste that I guess we would associate with salt. So instead of sprinkling on some salt, add some lemon juice or some herbs. And we talked yesterday in one of our sessions about Mrs. Dash is basically a non-sodium seasoning that has a bunch of herbs and spices in it rather than having the salt. And you can make your own recipe for seasoning to put into things. And what I'll do is I'll give you in the comments, I'll put a little recipe so that you can make it yourself. You don't have to go out and buy Mrs. Dash, but I think Mrs. Dash now has more than one variety as well. So you can look at something that maybe fits with your taste. You can always amp up the garlic and the onion, which is something that I've done as well. Because, I love my garlic. But I guess, just to kind of put an end to this, we really should be very mindful of how much salt that we're eating. I thought it was nice before when I was, I heard that, it's okay to have sodium or not sodium, is that, we need salts, our body needs salts. And it makes sense because, when you sweat, it's kind of a salty taste. But it's not because it's based on the sodium or the salt that we're used to calling salt. It's that our body needs all of the salts. And we really need to have a very careful balance between sodium and potassium. And the bottom line is, in our Western diet, we're getting way too much sodium, and for most of us, not enough potassium. So the bottom line would be to cut the sodium and increase the potassium, which you can find in your whole foods, fruits and vegetables. Yeah. So I know if I can do it, I think anyone can do it. And it's just a matter of really just, I guess, having the discipline to stick with it. And for me, it took about a week and a half. And it's like, oh, now things taste better. But I do use a lot more lemon now than I've ever used before. So much for salt. Any questions on that topic? No? Just maybe shocked that we shouldn't be having the salt altogether. All right.
So I actually do have a comment. And that is sometimes when you think like 20 years from now, what your body's going to be in, it can be like a wake up call. And I think that people, if they knew the damage that salt did, they might be willing to try and get rid of it. And the reason I say that is I've accompanied both my parents to the cardiologist's office. And it doesn't matter which office I go to, there's always a big poster in there in each of the rooms that I've been in about this, what salt does and how it hurts your heart.
Yeah.
But they didn't differentiate between potassium and sodium. They just said salt. So, yeah, or at least in my memory, that's what I remember salt. But just as to reiterate what you're saying, it's scary how just a little bit of white flakes on your food can just cause a whole bunch of problems a couple years down the road.
Yeah. Yeah, I think for the pleasure aspect, I know for myself, I think I was hiding behind the the thought that I had heard that salts are good for you, and they are good for us, but it's the how much of which salt. And when you say salt, like what you're seeing in the cardiologist's office is going to be table salt. There are potassium chloride, um, I guess, salt substitutes that you can have, but I think the best thing is to stop with the, I guess, sodium chloride, or putting the sodium in the salt on our food and using it in cooking, and getting rid of these processed foods that are really high in sodium, and changing them out for whole foods. That's the best thing to do, for sure. But it's easy just to ignore it because we don't see like you said, if you could have a crystal ball and see 20 years into the future, or maybe not even 20 years, because some people might not have 20 years. But we can really fool ourselves, for sure. You're absolutely right. And I know I was fooling myself, but now, actually looking at some of the research, I have a whole different appreciation now for the damage that sodium can do for us. All right. On that note, maybe we'll have a happier topic tomorrow. And try and reduce the amount of sodium. That's all I can say. Bye for now. We'll see you tomorrow, 2 p.m., same time.